Tanny had grown up alongside gorillas, and her bond with one of them was truly extraordinary. But when she left, she assumed that he would forget her entirely. She had been warned not to seek him out after all those years, but little did anyone know, his reaction to seeing her again would defy every expectation. Tanny, along with Aspen and her father, Damien, were excited to reconnect with the animals they'd once loved so deeply. They sailed on a boat, their hearts racing with anticipation, eager to greet the gorillas they had once cared for. The sight of them, just a short distance from the shore, made it impossible to contain their excitement. However, they had been cautioned to keep their distance. These gorillas had been living freely in the wild for years, and their human interactions had become a distant memory. But Tanny, in her heart, didn't believe that. She hoped desperately that the connection they shared was still as strong as ever. They were family, or were they? These gorillas had formed families of their own in the wild, families that never knew the confines of captivity. Getting too close could be dangerous, so everyone said. But Tanny didn't listen. As they drifted down the river, heads appeared from between the bushes. The gorillas were watching, their eyes sharp and curious. Tanny recognized him instantly, Jalta, the gorilla she had raised. Even though he had changed, even though he was now much bigger, the bond they shared was undeniable. When the boat finally came to a halt, Tanny jumped out, despite the warnings from her father and the guides. Jalta approached her, his enormous frame now towering over her, but still, there was no stopping the gorilla. No one could come between them now. If anything happened, Tanny would be on her own. Jalta came closer and without hesitation grabbed her by the arm. Her father moved as if to rush to her aid, but he knew that any sudden movement could escalate the situation. Was this how it was going to end? Tanny, who had spent her life loving gorillas, now faced the terrifying possibility that one of them might harm her. Could it really be? Could her childhood companion, her best friend, turn on her now? The bond between Tanny and Jalta began years ago, all thanks to her father Damien's mission to save animals. To fulfill that mission, he founded the Aspen Foundation, dedicated to rescuing animals, especially gorillas, and returning them to the wild. They also ran the Howlett Zoo in Canterbury, where animals who couldn't be rehabilitated were cared for. Tanny and her siblings spent their childhood immersed in this world, growing up alongside the animals, forging friendships with them, including with the gorillas. It was when Tanny was just over a year old that Bims, a gorilla, arrived at the zoo. He was injured, his family slaughtered by poachers, and he needed immediate care. Damien and his team took him in, and it wasn't long before Tanny and her siblings were as much a part of his life as the zookeepers. Bims became more than just an animal. He became one of their playmates. As Tanny grew, she spent countless hours in the gorilla enclosure, ensuring Bims never felt alone. Their friendship deepened in a way that was almost magical. But things were about to change in a way no one could have predicted. One day after school, Damien picked Tanny up with exciting news. There was a surprise waiting at home. And the surprise? A tiny baby gorilla named Jalta. Jalta had been orphaned when his mother was killed, and at such a young age, he couldn't survive on his own in the wild. He needed care, attention, and love. Tanny, now old enough to help, stepped in. She made sure he ate, comforted him when he was scared, and nurtured him as if he were her baby brother. But, of course, Jalta grew fast, much faster than a human sibling. Eventually, he outgrew their home. Gorillas simply weren't made to live inside. So it was time for Jalta to move to the zoo. But even there, the family didn't want him to be alone. Bims, the gorilla who had become so close to Tanny, was waiting for him in the enclosure. However, Bims was much larger than Jalta, and if things didn't go well, Bims could seriously harm the younger gorilla. They decided to introduce the two through a gate. The moment they touched each other's faces, it was clear that something magical was happening. Bims, surprisingly gentle, welcomed Jalta into his world. Soon after, the two were inseparable, and Tanny was once again allowed to play with them. They never showed jealousy, only affection. But convincing the public that such a bond was safe was no easy task. Tanny was so used to spending time with the gorillas that she didn't think twice when a photography team arrived at the zoo to document the unusual friendship. She believed the world would love to see it too. But the public's reaction was far from positive. The public was outraged that Tanny, along with the other children, was allowed to interact with the gorillas without proper safety measures. The backlash was swift and severe, and the zoo was given an ultimatum: implement safety protocols or face closure. Tanny, devastated, was no longer allowed to touch her two best friends, Jalta and Bims. She could only watch them from behind the glass of their enclosure. Tanny, too young to fully understand, could only feel the sharp sting of loss. The gorillas didn't understand either. They rushed to the glass, desperate to reach her, but their attempts were halted. Jalta would moan softly as he pressed his hand against the glass, trying to touch her, yearning to play. It was heartbreaking for both sides. But safety was not the only reason the humans had to limit their interactions with the gorillas. The time had come to prepare Jalta and Bims for the wild. They were growing stronger, and it was time to train them for life beyond the zoo. Months passed, and the gorillas underwent training to ensure their survival in the jungle. This had always been the goal of the Aspen Foundation, helping animals return to the wild whenever possible. It was time to send Jalta and Bims home. In Gabon, they found a sanctuary where the gorillas would be safe, yet free to roam. The moment had arrived, the last time Tanny would see them for a very long time. Before they were sedated for their journey, Tanny hugged Jalta and Bims tightly, one final embrace. The gorillas, excited to be near her, nuzzled her head, enjoying the closeness they had once shared. As the crates were loaded onto the truck and the gorillas were prepared for their journey back to Africa, Tanny couldn't help but feel the weight of what she was losing. She had spent her whole life loving these animals, and now she was saying goodbye to two of the closest family members she had ever known. She watched as they were driven away, knowing that this was the beginning of their new, wild lives, and yet the end of something irreplaceable. Years passed, and Damien made a trip to Africa to check on the gorillas. The news was nothing short of fantastic. Jalta and Bims were thriving. They had found a family group and were living exactly as they were meant to, free in the wild. Seeing them in their natural habitat, surrounded by other gorillas, made all the heartache of saying goodbye worthwhile. They were home, where they belonged. But though they had found their place in the wild, that didn't mean they were forgotten. Tanny often thought of her old playmates. It had been more than a decade since they returned to Africa, and in that time, Jalta and Bims had fully embraced their wild lives. They had grown nervous around humans, no longer seeking out any interaction. Tanny was told it would be better not to try to reconnect with them. Tanny herself had grown older and now worked for the Aspen Foundation, just like her father. She helped rescue countless animals, dedicating herself to the cause. But when Damien had a health scare, everything changed. Afterward, he began planning a trip back to Africa, a journey he had dreamed of for years. He wanted to see his favorite place again, and, if possible, to visit the gorillas one last time. It was a long and difficult trip to find Jalta, Bims, and their family. It wasn't something an older man could easily undertake, If Damien wanted to see them one last time, it had to happen soon. When Tanny heard about the trip, she immediately decided that she would go too. She had helped raise Jalta, and she needed to know how he was doing. She was eager, but surprisingly, no one else shared her enthusiasm. They warned her against going. It had been nearly 20 years since she last saw the gorillas. They were much bigger now, completely wild, and they might not even recognize her. The fear was that it would only shatter her memories of the apes, leaving her disappointed. But Tanny wouldn't be swayed. She refused to let her father go alone. She wanted to see the gorillas herself, no matter the outcome. Damien was the only one who understood. He agreed it would bring Tanny peace to see them in their natural home, whatever happened afterward. And so, the two of them set off. The first leg of the journey was to fly to Gabon, but there were no roads or airports near the forest where the gorillas lived. From there, they had to travel by off-road vehicle until they reached their base camp, where they would stay for several days. This way, they could go out in search of Jalta's family multiple times if needed. But they couldn't simply hike into the jungle. Instead, they would take a small boat along the river to reach the gorillas. Before they set out, the guides at the sanctuary gave them a stern warning. They made it clear that they couldn't just approach the gorillas. The guides would monitor the animals, and only when they deemed the gorillas calm enough could they come closer. They were also forbidden from touching or interacting with the gorillas. Jalta and Bims might have known them in the past, but
they were wild now, and their behavior could no longer be trusted. On the first day, when they set out on the river, the sight that greeted them was overwhelming. Faces appeared between the trees, gorillas watching them with curiosity. Tanny's heart skipped a beat as she saw those familiar eyes watching from the jungle. They had changed so much, but she recognized them instantly, Jalta and Bims. She gasped, tears welling up in her eyes. The sight of them brought back so many memories. And then, without warning, Jalta reached out and grabbed her with his powerful hands. She felt a rush of emotions, a flood of memories, but also a rising fear. Her knees buckled, and she trembled. But as her gaze locked with his, she swore she saw recognition in his eyes. Then, just like before, Jalta lowered his head to rest it against hers. It was as though time had never passed. Tanny ran her hand through his thick fur, just like she did when he was a baby, terrified of the world around him. Bims joined them, gently pushing his way through. He too seemed to know her. He placed one finger tenderly down her face, an unmistakable sign of affection. Then, as if they had never been apart, the two gorillas began to play with Damien, rolling over him with a gentle energy that showed their affection. Yet, with Tanny, there was a gentler, more careful energy. It was as if they understood they needed to be cautious with her. Eventually, Jalta and Bim's family joined the group, lingering at the edge. Father and daughter were in awe of the gorilla's natural habitat, but the two apes seemed determined to stay close to their first family. The guides were shocked. They hadn't expected the gorillas to react this way, reverting to the playful, affectionate creatures they had once known. It was clear that the gorillas had missed them. While they were happy to see Damien, their interactions with Tanny showed something deeper, something that felt like love. When it was time to return to the boat, the gorillas moaned softly, reluctant to let go. The scene was heartbreaking, both for Tanny and for the gorillas. Tanny, too, knew that this might be their last goodbye. There were no guarantees that she would ever return to see them again. She watched as Bims, still gentle as ever, hugged her one last time. He didn't hold tight, but his grasp was steady. He wasn't ready to let go. Tanny, with tears in her eyes, pulled his arms away. Then, standing in front of Jalta, her first baby, Tanny knew he would always have a special place in her heart. He rested his head on her chest, and she kissed the top of his head. "I love you," she whispered, knowing this might be the final time they would share this moment. She climbed onto the boat, and the gorillas watched them leave. Tanny was forever grateful that she hadn't listened to those who told her not to go. This experience was something she would never trade for anything. She had loved these gorillas, and now, she knew that they still cared for her too. The bond they shared had remained strong, no matter the years or the distance. The gorillas were where they belonged, free, wild, and happy. And Tanny would return home, inspired and determined to continue her work, saving animals, just as she had always done. Did you enjoy the story? Would you ever try to reconnect with a wild animal you knew as a child after so many years apart? Do you believe animals remember their first family? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you like the story, don't forget to subscribe to this channel and leave a like. What a beautiful example of interspecies friendship. Thanks so much for listening. See you in the next video. Have a great day.